And today I have the pleasure to present Whitney Phillips, who studies information politics and media ethics and is an associate professor in the School of Journalism and Communication at the University of Oregon. She earned a BA in philosophy from Humboldt State University in 2004 and an MFA in creative writing from Emerson College in 2007 and a PhD in English from the University of Oregon in 2012. She has authored and co-authored 5 academic books and a digital ethics guide for teens. Her most recent book is the topic of this program. And also presenting today, we have the pleasure of Mark Brockway, who hails from Denver, Colorado. He earned a PhD at the University of Notre Dame and a BA in political science at the University of Oklahoma. He's currently an assistant teaching professor in political science at Syracuse University. His research centers on political identity and activism. He investigates the consequences of changing political and social identities for party politics. His research also examines religion and politics, political polarization, and public opinion, and he has also co-authored The Shadow Gospel. And with that, I present Mark Brockway and Whitney Phillips.
Well, thank you so much, Fred. And hi, everybody. I'm so glad to be here with you all. Mark and I are going to be toggling. I'm going to do an overview of the book project, and then he'll be zeroing in on a topic related to education. So, I will share my screen and then get started. So, the just a couple of things to sort of set the table before this conversation. A couple of things that what we are trying to do in this book are, first of all, that when people talk about religious influence in the United States, very often they're taking for granted the idea that it's love of God that is actually driving that religious influence. And the argument that we're making in the Shadow Gospel is that that's actually wrong. That's not the best way to think about this. Maybe that's true for some people, but very often and much more prominently, what you see is actually hatred of the liberal devil. And we'll talk about where that concept comes from and the implications of that kind of concept in just a moment. The other thing that we're focusing on in this book is that structure our politics so straightforwardly actually isn't as straightforward as we assume that it is, that what that obscures is how bipartisan or apolitical many of the things that are deemed liberal or leftist actually are. And I was actually struck listening to the overview of the 100 Black Men organization that, the way that was framed in terms of increasing access to STEM training, for example, and otherwise just sort of foregrounding the experience of Black Americans. We all know that right now that would be not just described, but denounced as DEI. And beyond that, it would be presumed to be liberal or leftist. But there's nothing inherently liberal or leftist about access to STEM training. And yet, within this very strange world, we find ourselves, these things that aren't actually partisan get roped into partisan discourse. And we are telling the historical story about how that came to be. Again, I'll give you an overview of that in just a moment, but that's sort of where we're coming from in this project. The other thing that we're doing in this book is we're sort of challenging the assumption that white Christian nationalism is the default explanation for why we find ourselves in this very chaotic and confusing political moment. That a lot of the things that get described as white Christian nationalism, they're actually secular. They're secular in origin, they're secular in nature. And simultaneously, there's a religiosity to a lot of the seemingly secular things that attack liberals, for example, including the fact that a lot of people who are denouncing liberals will often use Satan language in order to do it. They talk about the liberals as actually being demonic. And so you see this kind of weird overlap of secular stuff and non-secular stuff. And there is a long historical story to tell about that. And again, that's what we're doing in this book. And so basically, the ways that we talk about and think about our politics don't actually explain how we got here. And we're arguing that the shadow gospel, the subject of this book, actually does that. So the way that we're describing the shadow gospel is an ideologically and theologically untethered media process and media product, I will explain in just a moment, that you can trace back to the Cold War, that gives rise to this amalgamated and shape-shifting figure of the liberal devil that gets mapped onto this very broad and weird conceptualization of the left and the Democratic Party. But what's especially weird about this is that people who are theological Christians or people who are ideological conservatives often find themselves getting lumped into this group known as the liberal devil, or described, denounced as being sort of leftist in orientation. You see that with a lot of the fights where, MAGA folks will attack, for example, Lutheran ministries because they're providing services to immigrants. But the people doing that could be Republican. And that's where, and very, very conservative and also Christian. So that sort of speaks to some of the oddity of what we're dealing with here. So to focus on the media process, because this is a really important part of the conversation, we're emphasizing throughout the book the relationship between media structures, regulatory changes, and also the sort of under the radar nature of right-wing funders, that basically as those things change over time, as I said, we're tracing this back to the Cold War, there are periods where these things shift. And as they shift, the nature of the shadow gospel, the nature of the liberal devil also shifts. And in particular, we focus on two moments of transition. First, how the shadow gospel hub sort of shifts from evangelical parachurches in the 1960s through the 60s to the 80s to what we describe as the Church of Fox News in the 90s. The present book is looking at where we are now, a much more diffused version of the shadow gospel that's even more unwieldy and stranger. But so those are the two hubs or the two shifts in hubs that we're talking about in the shadow gospel book and in the present book, which I'll also speak to about just a little bit at the end of this overview of what the book is doing. And as we're talking about these media processes, we're looking at several media dynamics that help sort of push the liberal devil along, you could say. That's the wraparound and decontextualization of messages, the way that they flow through, particularly social media now, but of course, before social media, information still traveled far and wide and in very strange ways. And thinking about how messages become disconnected from their origins, thinking about what happens if you are part of a media milieu where you're only getting repackaged versions of the same messaging, that has a very powerful impact on the degree to which people lend credence to certain claims about the liberal devil. The opacity of networks, not knowing where the funding is coming from, not knowing who is actively signal boosting whom, also plays an important role in this process. And the amalgamation of all of these things, media networks, media producers, media messages, what that all does is result in the media product of the shadow gospel. And we describe that in terms of anti-liberal demonology. It's this sense of threat coming from liberals in this very loose kind of understanding that are said to pose a fundamental threat to particular kinds of Christians, of conservatives, of families, and more broadly of understandings of America. And what we're talking about in this book is not a more simple dynamic of demonization. Demonization is, as we conceptualize it in this book, is pointing to something that actually is in the world and saying that's bad. And that could be a racist impulse. It could be any kind of thing. It could be focusing on something that isn't actually objectively bad, but it still gets called bad. But it's based on something that's real. It's based on something that's actually in the world. It's based on actual people, actual policies. What demonology is doing is it's sort of pointing to this vague sense that there is threat, but it's not localized in any kind of clear-cut way. What exactly is threatening shifts over time. So it isn't as simple as pointing, for example, to a group of immigrants and saying, I don't want immigrants in this country. That sometimes when people take an anti-immigrant perspective, it's more ideologically grounded demonization where it's we don't like immigrants, but a more demonological attitude towards immigrants is we don't like the liberals that let the immigrants into the country. So there's kind of a subtle difference there, but it's something that is worth differentiating. And again, I'll give a little bit more detail about how to think about that, how to differentiate straightforward demonization from much more unwieldy uh, demonology. Basically, the takeaway for right now is that anti-liberal demonology is really amorphous. It's essentially a fight against shadows. And in the Shadow Gospel book, we're really historicizing this, and a very important part of the conversation is anti-communism. This is a complicated term in American history. There was uh, ideologically grounded opposition to communism as Soviet style statism, to the things that were actually happening in the world, geopolitics. But there was also a much more nebulous and weirder thing that was happening at the same time that was less about what communism actually was about and was more about this sense of subversion. And Mark is going to talk about how anti-communism is harnessed by evangelicals in the 1950s that helped establish what we describe in the book as a shadow realm that basically all the liberals get thrust, or at least all the things that get described as liberals get thrust. And so he'll talk more about that. But to give you a sense of what the shadow realm actually is, there are three kind of phases I'll show in three visualizations now, where you've got these things, which again, some may be actually leftist. So if you're talking about leftist economic policy, that's obviously leftist. Premarital sex, however, is not partisan in any essential kind of way. And neither is humanism. It's not partisan by its essence. And yet, through these media processes that we're describing, these various things being shown on the screen, from psychologists to queerness to being Jewish to people who challenge patriarchal control, all of these different kinds of things become coded as being liberal or leftist, regardless of how political they actually are. So this is what you can see in the 1950s and 60s. We pulled this from things that we read, wing media sources. Over time, the list becomes more intense. So you start to see discourses around the Department of Education, which again, it's not actually a partisan organization, but it gets framed as such. The idea of multiculturalism, the idea of being outdoorsy, these various kinds of things, they get kind of increasingly strange as time goes on. Why is it that you have these concepts that aren't actually partisan becoming pushed into this shadow realm? Well, we have the mechanism that explains that it happens and why it happens too. So as you go on in time, even more stuff gets added to the shadow realm, and now we can see our friend DEI, during COVID masks were coded as liberal, even though they don't have a partisan identity. Drag shows, election affirmers in 2020, you basically have federal prosecutors, you have all this stuff that ends up being liberal, which only expands the surface area of what is perceived to be the liberal threat. So, what we hope that the book accomplishes through telling this story is offering a different account of evangelical influence, of thinking differently about political polarization. If the culture wars are ultimately a fight between an invented liberal devil, that really changes how you can and arguably should think about left-right polarization and culture wars more broadly. We also want to provide an explanation for understanding some of the fights around DEI at this time, attacks against LGBTQ existence, particularly trans existence, and then the gutting of the federal government, higher education, international, aid efforts, all of these things that have been ritualized as liberal and then attacked for being a threat to America. We're living through this right now, and we hope that the book helps explain a little bit about how we got here. So this is more fodder for Q&A. I'll run through this very quickly. We are currently, as we speak, finalizing the manuscript for our follow-up book to the Shadow Gospel. It's called Popular Demonology. And what we're looking at is, how do you identify demonology rhetorically? And one of the markers that we identify, and maybe you can think of some examples from your own experience, the conversations that you've had, is that it doesn't actually discuss people or policies. that if there is a group of people that is being discussed, for example, Haitian immigrants, the thing that's actually being framed as the underlying threat is the liberals that brought them to the country, the liberal policies. And so there just is this way that the conversations are actually very squishy because they're not really talking about people or policies. They're just talking about this vague threat. Another marker is the ritualization that I mentioned. It makes nonpartisan things seem partisan. And in the process, it sort of works to maintain this ever-shifting line between what real America is and then what sort of devil America is. The other thing that it does is it's often marked by what we call demonologic. It's this anti-liberal double standard. So, for example, the kinds of connections that Trump might have to Jeffrey Epstein, that's not a problem. But then when you look at the similar kinds of connections Bill Clinton is said to have with Jeffrey Epstein, well, that's the big problem. Now we have to open an investigation. Lots of examples in that realm. It gets real weird. And it's more weird than just simple cynicism or simple hypocrisy. There's something else going on. And what we advocate for in the book is just this relentless request for demand for specificity. We can't just talk about things as sort of loose amalgamations. We've got to talk about the specifics and refuse to allow people to push discourse where nothing is actually being specified. People are attacking DEI, but like, what is that? People are attacking critical race theory, but what is that? So it's a demand to specify or refuse to amalgamate stuff that actually isn't connected together and to refuse to ritualize. So I will leave it there, and then Mark will pick up the conversation with a more specific extended case study related to education. So thank you for your attention, and I look forward to any questions that you might have at the end. So thanks.
Hi, how's it going, everybody? Thanks definitely for having us here. I'll tell this story about how we came to be here slightly because I think it's kind of funny, which is that I reached out to Fred to see if he wanted us to like come talk, and Fred responded and said, well, it seems interesting, but our membership, which I guess is you all, uh, wants more uplift. I think it was back in March. Wants more uplifting topics, which at the time I completely understood. I also myself wanted to listen to some more uplifting topics, and so he punted me to the endless abyss. But I think it was a couple. Fred maybe can correct me in April or something like that or maybe June that he emailed me back and thought, I guess I don't know if everybody had gotten even more depressed and so wanted to commiserate with the depression in our book, but he asked us to come talk to you about like these topics because they, I think, probably and maybe even unfortunately have become much more relevant. And that is all to say that I hope, even if the things that we're kind of discussing today aren't certainly maybe uplifting, hopefully they are a little bit empowering. I think one of our goals, really Whitney's and I's goal, is to give people a tool for how to understand like what's going on around them. And hopefully that gives you a better grasp of what's happening and can give you a little bit more feeling of empowerment and understanding over those things that are happening. And like Whitney said, I think the main tool, hopefully, that we can give you is to understand what liberal means and what is liberal in the context of what's going on. And if I would have asked, you, and I do this a lot of times with my students, if I ever asked you, okay, like what does liberal mean? You'd have come up with a whole host of things. Maybe it's a liberal drives a hybrid car, or a liberal is in the Democratic Party, or a liberal supports these kinds of policies, or is pro-abortion or pro-immigration or pro-whatever. A huge list of things we could come up with as being liberal. And I guess what I'd like to argue at least, or show everybody today, is that all of those things are really wrong. And they're not what being liberal means, or at least not in the world that we live in right now. And I'm going to show you, I think, through this example of education, which is just one example, what liberal actually means in the world right now, what things are liberal, and kind of how that came to be. Again, to hopefully help us understand exactly what is going on and maybe a little bit about what needs to be done with it. Because my definition of liberal is actually quite different, or at least the definition of liberal that forms the core, or at least part of the core of our current societal definition of liberal is quite different. So I'm going to start to give you a little bit of an idea of that now. If I can figure out how to share my PowerPoint slides. Can everybody see my PowerPoint slides? Okay, great.
Yes.
So my definition of liberal, or I think that the definition of liberal that forms the core of what we now think is the definition of liberal that gets used in society, started at this meeting. And this was a meeting of 147, 77, about 150 fundamentalist preachers that met in St. Louis, Missouri from all over the country. And these preachers had met to fight liberalism. But their definition of liberalism was very specific. Their definition of liberalism was about liberalism in American Protestantism. You see, what was going on in the early 1940s when they met is that many American Protestants were ascribing to what we kind of now call, and even back then a bit, the social gospel. So this was the idea that the Bible wasn't just written in stone to be followed, that the teachings of Jesus could be interpreted and also applied to what was going on in everyday life, to do things like help the poor, feed the hungry, advocate for abolition, advocate for women's suffrage. And these folks in this room thought that that was total nonsense. And they wanted to keep their version of Protestantism as the core of American religion, what at the time was a fundamentalist Protestantism. And they not only wanted to keep that idea of fundamentalism at the core of American Protestantism, they also thought that this new liberal Protestantism, this modern Protestantism, was a huge threat, not just to them, but the rest of society. And so they didn't just defend their kind of little group. They didn't just defend fundamentalism or, try to argue for fundamentalism. They also began to fight liberalism very strongly and very purposefully. And a huge part of that fight against liberalism was based on education, which they saw as a significant avenue for this new idea of liberalism that was infecting American Protestantism. Here is a quote from that meeting. They say, "Our institutions of higher education are, in so many instances, in the grip of infidel leadership. We must be delivered from the domination of organized modernism." Also, that's a synonym for liberalism, which has its tentacles in every phase of educational work, if we hope for a revived and spiritually helpful church. And so again, it's worth noting that many institutions, in fact, most institutions of higher education at this time were based in American Protestantism, like that they had, like at SU, we have a huge chapel. They had very strong ties to American Protestantism. And a lot of that stuff has been lost in the past 8 years. But also that they thought that this was a huge breeding ground for this threat, right, for this modernism. So they thought that people were going to schools, going to universities, and essentially being brainwashed into this idea of modernism. They didn't restrict their critiques just to higher education. They also thought that this threat was happening in K through 12 schools. And they were so committed to fighting this threat that they formed an organization called the National Association of Christian Schools. And the job of the National Association of Christian Schools was to go around to different parents groups and school board meetings and that sort of thing in the late 1940s and early 1950s to really convince parents and other people of this threat and to show them how this modernism, this liberalism was coming to get not only them, but also their children. After one such meeting with the National Association of Christian Schools, a parents group in Kansas City, Missouri, said this. They said, "So we are looking to God to enable us to provide Christian schooling for our little ones, lest Satan get his poison into their minds, which would hinder their usefulness in the Lord's service and possibly wreck their lives and their souls for eternity." So you can notice a couple of things about this quote. First, it's not even just about liberalism. Now, liberals aren't just liberals, they're Satan. This mirrors language that these preachers used about liberal religion themselves, calling them the devil and saying that Satan was working through religion. The other thing is that the solution to this is Christian schools. That because of the incredible threat of this thing to children in schools, you had to send your children to Christian schools to save them from the threat. It wasn't about Christian schools being better or Christian schools even teaching Christian values. Like Whitney said, this isn't about, oh, God is great, so we should send our children to schools that teach about God and Jesus. This is Satan is coming for our children in schools. And so we need Christian schools to save them from the threat of Satan. Just as an example, right, of how the real driver behind their attacks against education are about the threat of the liberal devil. And the people that form these organizations, and the school education is just one example. They also have organizations that are centered on media. They have organizations that are centered on different kinds of youth outreach, especially. This conglomeration of organizations, which is headed by, sorry, I was supposed to go back, which was headed by this group of people formed, you can see there at the bottom, the National Association of Evangelicals. So in the 1940s, there was this transference from fundamentalist Christianity of the like 1920s and 30s to what we now know of as evangelical Christianity through these organizations, which were primarily focused on rooting out the threat of the liberal Satan in schools and media and religion and all over the place. And this would have been powerful enough, right? Like at this time, fundamentalists, we don't really, I guess a little bit today, but we don't think about like what we normally think of as fundamentalist Christianity is very widespread. Of course, we think about evangelical Christianity now as very widespread. But back then, these pastors had huge churches, like there was a huge following, so they were quite influential. And they would have been influential enough, right? Like these efforts to root out liberalism and Satan and like save children for God would have been quite influential in the 1940s. However, as Whitney kind of alluded to, they were about to get a real helping hand in the fight against communism. And what happened in the Cold War in the 1940s and 50s, and a little bit in the 60s, is that the fight against the liberal devil fused with the fight against communism. And so you have these new evangelicals that then join or spearhead really the fight against communism in a way that just creates this powder keg of, you know, like devil-based insanity that gets pointed in a lot of different directions. A lot of you in the room are probably familiar with Billy Graham. Yeah, oh, William, very good question. I can talk about that in Q&A. But new evangelicalism essentially transformed the fundamentalism of the 1890s and even earlier into something that's much more active, right? That's seeking out evil in the world and trying to fight it. And this is one example. And you're familiar with Billy Graham. If you're not, he's probably the most prominent and influential preacher in American history of any religious tradition, but especially evangelical Christianity. And during this time, he not only got very involved with anti-communism, but he was very quick to place the fight against communism and even liberalism with the fight against Satan. So he said this in one of his articles in the American Mercury called Satan's Religion: "The mysterious pull of this satanic religion," by which he means communism, is so strong that it has caused some citizens of America to become traitorous, betraying a benevolent land which had showered them with blessings innumerable. It has attracted some of our famous entertainers, some of our keenest politicians, and some of our outstanding educators. And this, it's to Bill's question, like this really sets it, this is the kind of thing that sets it apart from the fundamentalism of the past, right? Billy Graham isn't saying here Satan is in hell and he's trying to tempt you down in hell to steal your soul. What he's saying here is that Satan is all around us. It's in our schools, it's in government, it's in the media, and we have to root out that threat that exists in society as a whole. And it's a huge shift, again, in the way that religion is operating in the United States. And it means that religion has less and less to do with Jesus or the Bible or going to church, and over time has more and more and more to do with fighting Satan everywhere in society. Billy Graham was not alone. In fact, these new evangelicals were seen as a really key ally in the fight against communism by none other than the American federal government. The government itself, as you probably know, was fighting communism, or what they said was communism, which didn't really exist, through the House Un-American Activities Committee. This is a pamphlet put out by the House Un-American Activities Committee called Communism in Education. They also have a pamphlet called Communism in Religion. That is really interesting as well. In this pamphlet, it says one of the 100 things is, do any teachers in our schools actually submit to such a communist dictatorship? Yes, communist professors and teachers play an important role, of course, in the broad-scale campaign to convert our youth to Stalinism. How do they work? By slipping propaganda into classroom work and textbooks, and by leading gullible students into red-sponsored campus activities. It also tells you what you can do. You can know the facts by reading this pamphlet, right? By figuring out how to recognize communists. Interestingly enough, a lot of the ways that you recognize who a communist is have a lot to do with how you recognize what a liberal is, at least in terms of religion. It's, are they helping the poor? Are they advocating for civil rights? Are they talking about things like wealth inequality? If your college professor, for example, the pamphlet says, shows up to class and is talking a lot about wealth inequality, that's a sign that they're communist. Second way you can do is you can work in your own community to get rid of communists and communist influences, whether in the school system or anywhere else. So again, it's not even just about communist teachers. They could be anywhere, right? And third, and most importantly maybe, as you're going about this purge of communist and communist ideas in your school and in your community, be prepared to face accusations of witch hunting, red baiting, textbook burning, and strangling academic freedom. These are all standard smears in the communist propaganda routine. And so, sorry, I'm skipping ahead. And so again, notice the synergy between what evangelicals, these new evangelicals, are saying is the threat to children in schools, and what now the threat of communism is to children in schools. And that's no accident. And so that fusing with the threat, whether it's communism, whether it's Satan, whether it's both, to children, just again reaches this huge fever pitch with the Red Scare and communism. You know, again, you're probably familiar with like the McCarthy hearings, but also J. Edgar Hoover. You know, it's a pile of insanity that grips the nation for a few decades during the Cold War. But the threat of communism, which never really existed, frankly, dies down. People realize that, like, okay, maybe my kindergarten teacher is not a communist. Like, maybe they're actually not trying to indoctrinate my children to move to Russia and like be communist spies. And if our story was just about communism, right, if this was just, oh, evangelical Christians support communism, then our story would end there. But again, I told you that this is a fusing, that the fight against liberalism, used communism as a way to get Satan in the fight against the evil liberalism into kind of like the public ethos. And so what happens then is that once you take out communism, because it's not really about communism, what you're left with is just Satan. And as we get into the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, that is exactly what starts to happen in especially evangelical messaging around education. So this is a quote from the book Satan is Alive and Well on Planet Earth by Hal Lindsey. Hal Lindsey was one of the best-selling authors of the 1970s, not just of religious literature, of any literature at all. So he's wildly popular. He wrote a book that was a huge bestseller called The Late Great Planet Earth, about the end of the world. In this book, Satan is Alive and Well on Planet Earth, he says, and I should say I didn't cherry pick this. This is from the first page of his book. He said, a few years ago, I came face to face with a complete reversal in the academic community. So again, talking about education. They became involved with psychic research, parapsychology, ESP, mystic philosophies, and Eastern religions. Recently, there has been an upsurge in all forms of the occult. Witchcraft and Satan worship spread throughout campuses and cities. In America, a so-called civilized country, people are involved in weird rites and rituals. So again, what was just the fight against liberalism became then the fight against liberalism and Satan, became then the fight against liberalism, Satan, and communism, and is now back to just being the fight against this widespread Satanistic threat. In these sentences, we could easily replace it with communism and it would have fit a decade or two earlier. But now it's only about the threat of Satan. It wasn't just this writing, but a lot of other things too came together to kick off something that you may have heard of or remember called the Satanic Panics, where people thought Satan was everywhere and that there were like underground tunnels under daycares in which they were having satanic cult rituals and like ritually sacrificing animals and kids and all that sort of thing. So this like fever over Satan, in the same way that the fever over communism kind of gripped the country, this fever over Satanism gripped the country. And it did for many decades. This is a quote from the book, The Battle for the Public Schools, Humanism's Threat to Our Children from 1983, so a decade after the book that I just showed you. It says, open classrooms, discovery learning, choose your own courses, schools without failure, ghetto English, and other humanist inventions have done to learning what explicit sex education had done to morality. It is time for Christians to wake up and face the fact that turning the innocent, impressionable minds of our children over to humanist educators is like subjecting them to the devil. So again, worried about the threat of the devil in schools, that teachers, right? This is saying that teachers are using things like choose your own courses, discovery learning, whatever that is, to indoctrinate our children for Satan. Notice too, between these two quotes, that the definition of what the threat is expanding. So it's not just about communism anymore. It's not even just about helping the poor or wealth inequality. In Satan is Alive and Well on Planet Earth, it's about psychic research, philosophy, Eastern religions, ESP, witchcraft. In this book, it's about open classrooms, discovery learning, choose your own courses, school without failure, ghetto English, sex education. And so all of that sort of stuff is, again, forming that core of what it means to be liberal and what it means to be the liberal devil. And it comes from the direct line of the development of this definition is from what I told you, my definition of what liberalism is, which was, again, started by those evangelicals in the 1940s. And if it was just about Satan, right, like if it was only about actual Satan, like an actual satanic thing going on, then that's where our story would end, because by the mid 1980s, people also start, just like with communism, also started to realize that, okay, teachers probably are not doing ritual sacrifices in schools. Again, this is a thing that people actually thought. They actually dug up under a daycare center because they thought that there were secret tunnels under there. They started to realize that this isn't actually going on. And if it was about an actual Satan, it was about actual devils, actual rituals, actual witchcraft, then our story would end there. But of course it wasn't. And so as people began to realize that there wasn't like an actual devil coming to eat their children, they just shaved off that devil part and they kept everything else. So this book is called The Battle for Public Schools, and it talks about the devil. This book was it wasn't written by Phyllis Schlafly and Beverly LaHaye. It was just kind of compiled by Beverly LaHaye, who's the wife of Tim LaHaye, who I just showed you, wrote that other book. And now, instead of the threat of Satan, it's just about child abuse in the classroom. So after their fight against, I'm not going to go into exactly who, you might have heard of these folks before, but they kind of got together. Phyllis Schlafly is actually Catholic. Interestingly enough, that's a whole nother story. Bev LaHaye is like wife of Tim LaHaye, who's a prominent evangelical writer. In the 1960s and 70s, they were fighting against the Equal Rights Amendment, fighting against the expansion of women's rights. After they kind of won that fight, they turned their attention to schools. And they go on this campaign around the country to compel the Department of Education to adopt what they call the Protection of People's Rights Amendment. Basically, they were saying that schools were indoctrinating and abusing children, and that this needed to stop. And in order to do so, you needed to pass this amendment. And so what they did was they gathered a whole kind of conglomeration of people to testify to what was going on in schools. So basically, you can imagine these two folks getting a bunch of different kinds of people to appear before the Department of Education to tell them about the horrors that were going on in public schools at the time, to compel them to adopt this amendment. And this is just the testimony of one of those people. He says, atheistic humanism, Reverend Ronald Watson, he says, atheistic humanism is being taught in our schools. We parents have a right to protect our children from this godless religion and the irresponsibility it promotes. Our schools teach an irresponsible sexual behavior such as is found with dogs and cats. The humanism our children are being taught is actually subhumanism. Our children need to be protected against such teaching. So this quote could easily contain communism. It could easily contain a reference to the devil, but it contains neither, right? It's just about this kind of other threat centered in this case around sexual deviance. And again, it highlights the fact that this isn't ever about the thing that it says it's about. By the mid 1980s, when this is being sort of promulgated in front of the Department of Education, that threat had moved on to different things. Reverend Watson is going to tell us in a second who he thinks is doing the indoctrination of kids in schools in this instance. It's usually a lot of different things. Ronald Watson is going to tell us in a second exactly who is now the threat. Okay, we moved on from communism, we moved on from Satan, and who is it now? He says as evidence, right, of all of this horrible thing going on in schools, he says that homosexuality in schools was presented as an alternative lifestyle. So again, the idea that our schools are teaching an irresponsible sexual behavior such as is found with dogs and cats, his evidence that this is going on is that the schools are teaching essentially that gay people are okay. And so hopefully by now you can see how not only that definition of who is liberal, who is a threat, who is the liberal devil is expanding, but it's also being pointed at a whole ton of different groups and can be quite easily pointed essentially at the drop of a hat at all sorts of different groups. So we've moved from, right, this like very dark conspiratorial idea that that Satan and Satan worshipers are like sacrificing our children in schools, to this kind of more like I would say offensive or homophobic idea that just teaching that being gay is okay means that you're indoctrinating our children and threatening our children in schools. And then it gets taken an even step further through a kind of a network of evangelical people and organizations to have not even a homophobic tone, not a conspiratorial tone, but quite a positive tone. So by the mid 1990s, we have this contract with American Family that gets put out by the Christian Coalition, a conservative evangelical organization. It uses much of the same language that would have been used a decade earlier to attack gay people in schools, to do all this other sort of, I think, very hateful stuff. But instead of saying, oh, we don't like gay people, although they actually do say a lot of that in this book, they mainly paint their argument in terms of local control of education, promoting school choice, and protecting parents' rights. Things that sound very, very simple and easy. And so by the 1990s, you see this entire evolution from something that sounds really, really nuts, that Satan is eating our children in schools, to something that sounds much less nuts. Oh, we should promote school choice. But they mean the exact same thing. And that's a big takeaway, hopefully, that you can take away from this presentation, that they mean the exact same thing. Because by the time we get to our current situation, where we find ourselves, and I'll kind of try to wrap it up a little bit with this, because I know I've gone a bit over time. By the time we get to our current situation, we're kind of in all three of those worlds at once. So this is a quote from Donald Trump when he was talking in front of a Moms for Liberty group, which is again, they use the parent and student rights group. And this is what he is talking about, in terms of schools. He says, the transgender thing is incredible. Think of it. Your kid goes to school and comes home a few days later with an operation. The school decides what's going to happen with your child. The founder who he's talking to later in the conversation says, transgender is a social contagion that has taken over our country. So Whitney, talked a lot about like DEI and CRT, critical race theory and diversity, equity, inclusion, and all these things that kind of form that amalgamation of things that are a threat. And the situation that we find ourselves in now is that all of those things are being mobilized and pointed at education in a very real and dangerous way. Like Donald Trump's quote here actually could fit in the era of satanic panics that were saying, oh, they're doing ritual sacrifices on our children. This quote now, it's not just something that he said off the top of his head. One of the executive orders about education now includes a clause banning schools from doing mutilative surgeries on children. And so I think, again, a big takeaway, hopefully, that you can take away from this presentation, or at least a tool that you can use, is that when you hear this sort of stuff, whether it sounds like parents' rights or students' rights, whether it sounds like something positive, whether it sounds like something that's kind of transphobic or homophobic or against immigrants or against something, right? Whether it's transgender people are like destroying our world. Whether it sounds like one of those against things, or whether it sounds like even downright conspiratorial, like this quote. Just remember that all of those things are the same thing. All of those things are defining the liberal threat and trying to expand that liberal threat in a way that really is both dangerous, but also doesn't make any sense. So I saw, I think, some good quotes in the chat. That's about all I have. I definitely have more material, but I'm sorry that I went a little bit over time with some of the things I share. I'm happy to answer any questions at all. Obviously, we are happy to answer any questions at all. But our hope is, I know it's like depressing. I know it's scary and depressing to think about, like, you know, now the federal government of the United States basically thinks like a huge group of Americans is satanically evil and is going after them as such. But I don't
Thank
know.
you, Whitney and Mark. Very interesting stuff. I was struck when Whitney was talking about all the things, all the list of bugaboos that have joined the social, the shadow realm. What hasn't is almost my consideration.
Oh, that's why figuring out the rhetorical markers is so important because I mean, for a time within the shadow realm existed, for example, Ghislaine Maxwell and like the Epstein story broadly. But as that story has kind of shifted in this very weird way, as it has over the last few weeks, I mean, the idea that Ghislaine Maxwell would be even painted as a sympathetic figure by certain people within MAGA media, it speaks to the fact that things can sometimes be plucked out of the shadow realm. That, the idea that you've got these elites and they're mostly Democrats and they're doing all this terrible stuff to children, that the actual ringleader of an actual child sex ring ends up becoming rehabilitated, I guess, because she's maybe going to name names of Democrats. And so that's one place where sort of thinking about how do you identify what fits within the shadow realm and what doesn't matters because it doesn't have apparent rhyme or reason except that the things that are in the shadow realm are associated with liberals and the people outside of the shadow realm are the people who are fighting those liberals, and that those things can shift over time because it's not actually based in any kind of partisan or real essence. So figuring out, okay, when are people talking about actual people, places, and things, actual policies, versus when are they just talking about this broad threat? That's a way of being able to assess that question. Are we talking about demonology right now versus are we talking about something else? And not everything that goes into the realm stays in the realm. And that's why you've really got to be on your toes with this sort of stuff.
Yeah, I saw the great example I just read about the use of considering white males a protected class under the Civil Rights Act because they're not getting equal admission to colleges. So this is like, what am I missing here? Am I confused?
Well, that right there, I mean, that sort of fits into some of the what we were talking about the demonologic, where you've got these sort of different categories for different groups of people. So around speech on college campuses, for example, the kind of there's extreme almost speech absolutism for certain groups of people, but then for other groups of people, you can't say anything or else you might have your visa revoked or you might be kicked out of school, whatever might happen to you. That you've got all these really weird things where you're looking at, well, wait a second, I thought you said you were in favor of free speech, or wait a second, I thought you were opposed to identity-based quotas for schools. Like that as long as it's fighting against the liberal threat or positioning itself against it, then it becomes okay. But if it doesn't, then it becomes a problem. And so this schema helps you look at the kind of cases like you're describing, where you're like, wait a second, this doesn't make any sense. It doesn't up to a point, but it actually kind of does if you recognize the sort of ritualized process that it's partaking in. So it's all just basically, it's very weird. And the way that we typically talk about politics, it does not account for all of that weirdness.
Understand. So Bill McComb had some comments in the chat. Mark caught one of them about is it racism a major factor? Bill also asked, wasn't fundamentalism earlier? And then also asked, didn't the Catholics resent communism because they lost Poland to the Soviets?
Yeah, I mean, so that's partly true. The thing about, and Catholics are some of the most virulent anti-communists, especially like Canada. Um, I don't know. I mean, like the Catholic question is interesting, especially because for a long time, of course, Catholics were part of the threat. Like evangelical Christians and especially Southern Baptists hated Catholics for a long time, a fact that people have like forgotten. Now I've seen more. Now lately, I've seen Catholics join the like evangelically loose amalgam, like the loose kind of group of people that are adopting, especially around gender, um, a lot of the ungrounded language that was developed through processes we talked about. Even the Pope talked about the threat of like radical gender ideology a couple of years ago. And so I think, especially in the United States, where Catholics tend to be, especially white Catholics tend to be more aligned with um, kind of conservative evangelicals, we're in a pretty dangerous spot in which, I mean, look at J.D. Vance, right? In which now Catholics too are really at the center of the driving of this shadow gospel-y, weird language around things, which I don't like.
Well, and to piggyback off of the point about Catholics, I mean, so J.D. Vance, one of his critiques, as Doge was taking its cudgel to various organizations around the country, part of the argument was that you would have these aid organizations, these Catholic aid organizations, trying to help immigrants and help resettle people. And J.D. Vance took great issue with that and was attacking those Catholics for essentially harboring immigrants and basically doing Jesus stuff. So JD Vance would go on the offensive against that. So, and historically too, it wasn't just that Catholics could be very, very anti-communist. Catholics were often subject to extraordinary anti-communist attack because the idea of having some sort of communal concern and care about, trying to make a difference in the world, those values were aligned in anti-communist minds with communism. So Catholics are very interesting because they have been on the receiving end of a lot of this stuff, but they've also doled it out. And so you see that historically, but you're also seeing it currently. So it's just it's very tricky to navigate. And one of the ways to ask yourself, again, assessing what are you dealing with here, is the religious person you're talking about, are they foregrounding Jesus and the things that Jesus said and what the Bible said, which you might take issue with? But the first question is, are they talking about God and Jesus, or are they talking about the liberal devil? And anytime you answer the question, actually, they're talking about the liberal devil, that necessitates a different kind of conversation than if what they're doing is trying to align with like Jesus stuff. Those are very different articulations of Christianity, regardless of the particular denomination. And Fred, was your hand up a second ago?
Yes, it
Yeah,
was,
it
Fred.
was. You sort of answered the question, but what you just said reminded me of a book, came out about 2004, written by an attorney who was a Baptist. It was called "You Call Yourself a Christian and You Voted for Who?" And he
Mhm.
basically says that true Christians should be loving their neighbor and not bringing religion into the church and vice versa. And he just basically echoed what you just said.
Into the government.
Yeah.
Yeah,
The government.
it's weird stuff. And the problem is that culturally in the United States, we're sort of primed. If you hear any reference to God, the assumption is that you're dealing with quote unquote normal religion. But just because somebody is talking about God doesn't mean that what they're focusing on is actually God. Very often it's something else. But people then become sort of nervous. They don't want to attack religion. They don't want to attack Christians or being accused of having anti-Christian bias. So Christianity ends up being both a sword and a shield when it is coming from this position of actually being more preoccupied with the devil than caring at all about the things that Jesus said.
And just to piggyback off that too, that applies to fundamentalism as well. So it's not just sort of a more social gospel interpretation of the Bible that is also problematic for like in the demonology. If you're very fundamentalist and very strictly follow the Bible, then that also is problematic because you're grounding your things in an actual belief about religion, right? Like we might think that fundamentalism is problematic, and it is. But we have to look no further than Mike Pence to see how somebody who's very conservative and I would, very fundamentalist also is now a liberal, right? Like on January 6th, they wanted the head of Mike Pence, right? So now we're in this really insane world where being very fundamentalist Christian and also very actually conservative, like I like half believe that Mike Pence actually believes some of the things he says about small government and the Constitution, blah, 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 blah. That those things make you a liberal. And that's weird. Like, we're in a world where Mike Pence is a super liberal.
Yeah,
And
Mike Pence and Liz Cheney. I mean,
and Liz Cheney
and sort of
and
using
Boehner.
yeah, all of these folks that, again, part of what we're trying to do in the book is to really challenge. Okay, so we think we have these structural frameworks that explain our politics, but the second you bring up Mike Pence as a counterexample, you're like, wait, what? Like, how does this even work? And so it just means we've got to think differently about what is happening, what the origins of it are, what the focus of it is, and the white Christian nationalist frame. Although some people 100% are white Christian nationalists, they actually want they want a theocracy. When you look more closely at that, very often they don't want the Bible. They don't like the Bible. They don't like Jesus very much. And even the ones that do talk about Jesus and do seem to want to restrict people in sort of fundamentalist ways, very often they talk a lot more about the liberal devil than they do about anything else. So even people who are real white Christian nationalists sort of don't align with what they're doing something else that's just super weird. So it's just weird on top of weird on top of weird.
I think it's based on fear and greed and emotion. They don't base on anything on fact or examine issues in depth and see the logical consequences of their actions. It's just, greed and fear and emotion.
Well, I mean, the question, so Ralph just raised an important question. Doesn't this boil down to tribalism? There's a really, if you're interested in this question about, what is polarization and how does it work and does it exist? A great book to read is Hiram and Verlin Lewis's The Myth of Left and Right. And what it shows is historically what we understand to be left and right. Basically every policy that we currently associate with the left was at one point regarded as the right, and vice versa, that these things, the sort of ways the categories have always worked, has been really nebulous and it's never really stayed put. And people clearly identify with one tribe or the other tribe, but it's not actually based on partisan essence, which then just sort of underscores that the solid stuff that we think is solid actually isn't. And so, you can, I mean, I don't know if I would say that it just boils down to tribalism, because I think that this is also a conversation about what media are people engaging in and how do media shape people's worldviews. And tribalism just implies that there's some sort of like human nature element to this. And I think there's a way to kind of complicate that because of how we receive information and how we cognize that information. So I think that part of the conversation really needs to be brought into this discussion. But basically the idea is that, there is no strict division between anything. It's just that we kind of think it is, and then that tricks us from really zeroing in on these examples like Mike Pence and Liz Cheney that should challenge our understanding of what's happening, but don't often, because we just think, well, we're polarized and that's it. But it's a more complicated point than that. But I think Ralph, that's a really interesting and important question, and would really recommend that book if you're interested in that discussion. And then Ben, I think Ben has
Yeah,
their hand up.
Ben?
Yes, hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, hi.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you for coming and talk to us, and great work. I have a comment and a question. So first, the comment is, I mean, trying to I appreciate what you guys are doing, but trying to like follow and catalog and rationalize the rhetoric that these fundamental right-wing Christian nationalists are trying to expound. It's like mind-numbing because, as you point out, there's contradictions and hypocrisies and fraud and lies all over the place. So you're just constantly trying to, I guess, like capture their verbal rhetoric and rationalize it to something that can't be rationalized. And it's
You define what you mean by rationalize?
well, so like for example, when you're pointing out their contradictions, right? First, it was everything that they hated was because of communism. And then when they realized that that students were not being indoctrinated by communist ideology in schools, that rhetoric then easily shifts to something else, right? It could just be like plug and play. You can plug in whatever you don't like, and then they'll just find some way to also hate that using the exact same logic, even though that logic didn't make sense in the first place, in the first instance, right? Whether it be communism, whether it be the liberal devil, whether it be LGBT, DEI, wokeism, whatever. So to me, it just boils down to like, we want power, and we're going to say and do anything we want to get that power, whether our logic makes sense or not, right? And we will say and do whatever we need to do to like obtain the power that we want to get.
I don't think that I don't think that we're in disagreement. What I would say is that because the rhetoric that's used is deceptive, that
Right.
it can convince a lot of people that what they're talking about is whatever the gender ideology is really a problem. And it sounds like they're talking about something specific. So as I understand it, our work, it's not so much about sort of just rationalizing or saying like it actually makes sense. It's more about saying, here's what's going on beneath the surface so that people can understand what the argument actually is about. Because if what they're talking about is protecting parents' rights or making sure, that kids are protected, who would disagree with that? No one would disagree with that. But when you realize that what they're arguing against is something that isn't actually about protecting children, it's if you want to use your framing, that it's about sort of maintaining their position in power, maintaining who counts as a real American, and then only protecting those people, that's dangerous. And so
Very much.
it's more about identifying what are these rhetorical markers so that people can resist it. And that's how I understand the project ultimately.
Okay, that's fair. Um, Now also the question part is there are also a lot of excellent scholars and journalists who also work in this space who track let's say um, Christian nationalists, right-wing fundamentalists. And do you work or collaborate or follow any of their work? For example, uh, oh, I'm blanking her name, but she spoke at our group a couple years ago.
Catherine,
Yes,
no,
Catherine
Stewart.
Stewart, Catherine
yes,
Stewart,
yes.
um, Robert P. Jones from the PRRI,
Yeah.
Chris Hedges, the Freedom from Religion Foundation, like all of these institutions, journalists, researchers, they do very similar work trying to, I don't know, keep tabs for us on, this Christian fundamentalist movement. Do you work or collaborate with any of them?
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, we don't collaborate with them. I mean, we're very familiar with their work. Um, I would say a couple of things. The first is that the idea, I think even if you noticed how you asked the question,
Okay.
which is like that they are helping us keep, meaning like we're over here and like we're sane and like we know what's going on.
Okay.
Keep tabs on this group of Christian nationalist fundamentalists
Hmm.
want to take over the country for like Christian values or whatever. That framing, like the idea that there's this group over here and that there's this group of very fundamentalist like Christian nationalists that want to take over their country, that world is a world that's created that supports very strongly the kind of general idea of demonology. And it does so by making us think that what these folks are doing is Christian and nationalist and fundamentalist and coherent. So all of those groups, all of those people that you talked about are involved in a project which is actually doing the thing that, you kind of said is we shouldn't do, which I agree with you, which is to give a lot of coherence to something that isn't coherent, right? Like the PRRI and a lot of the different people that track Christian nationalism are using, for example, survey instruments to ask, like, what percentage of the population is Christian nationalist? there's a lot of problems with those survey instruments. One is that they don't actually track Christian nationalism. The other is that the underlying thing, and this is our argument, the underlying thing that they're trying to keep a hold on and track is not a thing that is easily understood or quantifiable for all the reasons that we just, talked about. And I'm not necessarily criticizing their work. I mean, I'm a religion politics scholar. I know this is sort of my world, and doing survey research and, again, trying to track what different religious groups are doing. But the people that are actually trying to take over the United States to establish an actual Iranian style theocracy, that's nobody. There's nobody trying to do that. And a lot of people may look like they're trying to do that. And a lot of people may want to make you think that that's exactly what they're trying to do. But in reality, they're much more secular, frankly, even than you are, right? They have absolutely no religious content whatsoever. And so calling them Christian, giving them this incredible amount of power that comes with adherence to religious tradition, our argument is saying, look, we're just feeding the beast. Let's stop calling them something that they are not. They call themselves Christian nationalists. They call themselves Christian. Why are we parroting that same rhetoric about those groups? That's help feeding into their legitimacy.
And so how should we frame them then?
They're doing crazy, insane shit, right? They are demonologists. What those people are saying, all of those people that you think are Christian nationalists, what they're doing is saying, Satan is coming to eat your children. Everybody is a liberal devil, and they're trying to undermine everything about American society. And I think about it like this, right? If I came to your door, if I knocked on your door tomorrow and I said, Satan is coming to eat your children, please vote for me. You would not vote for me, right? If I had a sign on the street that you would think that I need mental health, right? You would be like, okay.
But Mark, isn't that what the White House is saying now?
Actually, it's sort of right. Again, I mean, you're totally right. But if I say to you, right, if I said to you, oh, schools are trying to teach your children, schools are teaching pornography to your children. Or if I said to you, oh, parents need a bigger role in students' education, you would say, great. That, great. I'll vote for you. That's something that I can get behind. And it's that kind of thing that we're trying to get you to get folks, everybody, ourselves, a lot of the times, to develop this tool to say, look, when Donald Trump talks about radical transgender ideology, the thing that he's really saying is really weird and really strange and doesn't make any sense at all. And starting from that point, rather than a point that actually gives shape to that, right? When Donald Trump says, okay, radical gender ideology, the thing we should not do is say, oh, that's Christian nationalism. Because Christians hate transgender people and they want to get rid of transgender people. Christians don't hate transgender people. That is something that was completely invented by shadow gospel-y stuff to convince us that Christians hate transgender people, so they could convince Christians to hate transgender people.
Okay. Robin, you had your hand raised. You have a question?
Yeah. Well, what I'm seeing here is a propaganda war. That it's really designed to get people to act in a particular way. They are looking for power and privilege. They want is the government to fund religion again, starting off with the schools, and they're winning. Very likely that vouchers and so on will become a national thing. Maybe not in New York, but in other places, yeah. And there's a strong movement in New York too. They're looking for money. They're looking for resources. And then to do it, they're using the traditional tools of propaganda. Demonizing the other guy is one of the biggest tools that is used in propaganda. You try to demonize the other fellow, whether it's literally in terms of calling them Satan, or on the other side, calling them calling them communist. It's and you know it's not like there isn't some truth there. It's you use the language that inflames emotion, but there's a lot of truth to what they're looking at. Uh, Jonathan Haidt, in his book Coddling of the American Mind, points out that a kind of neo-Marxist philosophy has indeed taken over American educational establishment, and whether you like it or not, and there's an awful lot of that kind of language, and people look at it and they say, yeah, it's neo-Marxist, but it's okay. Well, I don't know. It depends on what side you're looking at it on. But you pick that out, and now you suddenly, if you focus it, put a spotlight on it, exaggerate it, and look for the absolute worst you can. Now you've got the internet, you've got the preaching establishment going hammer and tongs. But it's to me, it looks like what we're looking at is not reality. There's no attempt at rational people, like humanists, tend to try to figure out what's really going on. They use rational techniques to get at a kind of universally available truth. The propaganda doesn't do that, and this is a monster campaign. I think that the Christian nationalists are part of it, but I think that there are many other groups. The Republican Party and the Democratic Party are both in their respective ways guilty of doing this and of perpetuating this debate war based upon the extremes of propaganda rather than the more reasonable attempt to find common values. I think this is a real danger.
Rob, Whitney and Mark have another engagement at 2:30. They have to go.
Oh.
Send us an email though. I love answering emails from
Yeah,
people.
please. Yeah, no, I
Get my
mean,
email.
Not from administrators. If you're a university administrator, don't send me an email because
well,
but
we
you're a real
really
person.
yes, no, we love to have these kinds of conversations, and your questions are great, and it's such a strange moment. So the more kind of engagement that we can get on this, the better. So thank you for inviting us today, and we're easy to find on the internet, so come find us.
Yeah, well, again, thank you very much. I do appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Yes.
everybody.
Okay, bye everybody. Thank you.
Bye.